Okay, so this is titled Ethical Consumerism. I don't, however, want it to just be a talk about like a list of things to or places you can buy what you already buy. And I think most people are becoming wise to some of the nuances of conscious consumerism, is another way of phrasing it, in terms of less plastic and thinking about supply chains and air miles and those sorts of things. So what I really wanted to do this evening was kind of provide a bit more of a systems overview of how, I guess, society has gotten to this point and what a future might look like, and lessons we can learn about how to see the system for what it is. Because when we do that, we can be more conscious of how we've ended up here and what the future might look like. So just to start with, I wanted to have this verse on the screen. This is Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman, saying, "Believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem you will worship the Father." And essentially, I see this as an example of Jesus transcending a system. The woman in this scenario is looking from one mountain at another mountain. She's very much in the system. She's on a mountain, she's looking at another mountain. If you were on the mountain in Jerusalem looking over at her mountain, you'd be in the system as well. But what Jesus does is says that an hour is coming when it's neither going to be this mountain nor that mountain. He takes an aerial view of the situation. And interestingly, when you do that, when you step outside of a system like the worship system Jesus was talking about, which he frequently did, he frequently transcends the cultural norms in his society, and he steps outside of it. He creates a space outside of the system to look back at it. And when you elevate your consciousness to that position, you are able to see both the positives, the negatives, the flaws in a system, and hopefully integrate the good parts into something better. So, yeah, as I say, we're not going to look so much at places that are ethical and sustainable. The Google's out there. We can all go and Google, especially if you go to ethicalconsumer.org, which is a particularly good one for finding places to shop, and also company profiles. If you want to think about where you're sourcing things from, you can always get a company profile from ethicalconsumer.org, which is a very good website. You have to subscribe to it, though, to get the full details. But we're going to have a look at a systems overview of things. We're going to look at the current consumer system, the disconnects in that system, and we're going to let the system, or think about ways in which we can let the system see itself. How can we step outside of this system that we're in and look at it and have a bit more consciousness about it? Because I think at this point, especially within, say, like the clothing industry or the food industry, having the consumer be conscious of the system is probably the last thing much of the industry really wants to do. So let me give you an example here. All systems are nested systems. They all sit within the world on the biggest level. They all sit within a certain economy. They sit within an industry, and often we as consumers sit in some ways in that industry, and it's all nested. What I find, I guess, since the Industrial Revolution, we've done is this: we've separated, in many ways, the economy from the world. We are producing enough resources and enough waste for 1.5 Earths, which, if my maths is right, is 0.5 of an Earth more than we've got. So there's a disconnect between the amount that the world produces and the amount that it can sustain. So that's one of the first things that happens, is the economy often separates itself from reality, the reality of resources, and that's a real disconnect within the system. The second thing that I see happening is the industry inflates the me. So this is through advertising, through providing shops that are very convenient, one-stop shopping, that sort of thing, and also extremely low prices means that when you walk into a store, it's all about you, and it's all about your bargains that you can get, and advertising is all about making yourself look better and et cetera, getting up on the latest fashions and things. And since like the 50s with a big advertising boom, we've really inflated the consumer to the point where we're not asking the consumer to consider anything about the industry. We're not asking the consumer to consider anything about the economics of buying extremely cheap clothing or where their food is coming from. We're just hiding it all behind billboards, essentially. And for the majority of people, this is the way life is. Industry is not a consideration. But I feel maybe in the last 5 years or so, especially with Greta Thunberg and the climate crisis and the school strike and those sorts of things making the headlines, there is an element of the industry kind of just breaking out behind the me. Like there's almost like we're becoming more conscious, a small handful of society is becoming more conscious of how big and how ugly this industry is. And actually when we look behind the advertising and the billboards, we're seeing something quite big and ugly. And so I think probably for many of us here and many of our demographic, we're beginning to maybe bring this in a bit, thinking, okay, well, maybe I should use less plastic. Maybe I should buy secondhand. Maybe I should do these sorts of things. And the more we shrink the me part of this and we kind of start pushing against the billboards and the advertising and things, we get to see really how big and ugly this industry is. It could be any industry really, whether it's clothing, food, automobiles, those sorts of things. But I think most of the country is in that kind of place, just on the cusp of understanding that something is going ahead, because we know that's happening because it's filtering into policy. Often government policy is the last thing to catch up. So the things about banning plastic and having more consciousness in government shows that there's more consciousness going on. So that's just an idea of thinking about nested systems. But one of the frameworks I really want to use this evening is something called integral theory, which will really show us how culturally where we're sitting with consumerism, because it's part of an evolution of economics. It's an evolution of how we view the world's resources, and integral theory really maps onto lots of different things. And I'm using the word map there because it is very much a broad map. Integral theory is always kind of put forward as something which is as a global map. If you imagine a map of the world, you can see that the UK and New Zealand are pretty far away from each other on a global map, but it's not a particularly good map for getting to the corner shop. And integral theory is kind of the global map. It's a big picture thing, but not a micro map, not for getting to the corner store with, is one way you can describe it. So, and it'll become clear as to why I'm using this and how it fits with our topic this evening. It essentially catalogues 4 stages of human cultural development, and we're going to go through these in some detail. And this works on a historical level as well. It maps across lots of things. It maps across church culture, particularly interestingly as well, I find. But in terms of history, we started out with kind of various tribes, impulsive leadership, and moving on then to more of a hierarchical king at the top feudal system, and then into a achievist stage. After you've achieved the stability of the traditional phase, you're really into growth, and then you get some pushback against growth with a pluralist kind of stage that kind of regulates the growth of the previous stage, and then that evolutionary stage is kind of what's next. But we're focusing really here. This is where ethical consumerism takes its place, because it fits into a growth-centric world, but one that's also kind of being regulated by values-driven culture as well. So I'm going to dive in a little bit more into these, starting with that impulsive culture. It's very tribal, and it's interesting how power shifts in each of these cultures. With the impulsive culture, the power is in the most dominant leader, the strongest one. And it's only changed when that leader is toppled. And thinking about actual tribes here, a chieftain is toppled, their family gets removed, and a new family gets put in place. So power only changes when the monolithic leader is removed and a new one is put in, making a very fragile society. We still see this kind of culture today within probably the criminal underworld, the mafia sort of world. And then the next culture that develops out of this one is the traditional one, and each culture that develops out of the previous one is reactionary. So the traditional culture is a reaction to that tribalist culture. it creates a hierarchy. So if there's a powerful position, like we only got the Pope at the top of this pyramid here, if someone comes and takes out the Pope, the power of the position of the Pope still remains. Even if they take the Pope out, they can just put another one in, and the power of the system is still in place. So it provides much more stability and much more structure, because power is held in ranks, and makes it much more stable and long lasting. It's got a hierarchical mentality, so it's things like an army or like a Catholic Church system. The problem in this system is that it lacks innovation. So this guy down at the bottom here, if he has a bright idea, he has to kind of tell the person above him, who has to tell the person above him, who has to tell the person above him to actually implement any change, and then that all trickles back down again. And so any innovation really gets stuck in this hierarchy because it has to move across power structures and things. So then moving into the next reaction against the traditional hierarchical model is the achievist culture. This is the new world. This is what America was kind of built on as a reaction against the British colonies and the monarchy, saying, well, actually, if I have a bright idea and I'm at the bottom, I should be able to implement and activate that bright idea depending on how good I am at performing. So that's very meritocratic. It's very data-driven. It's very innovative, and anyone can see in this thing. So it's the real American dream. There's a kind of a machine mentality, because this comes around the same time as the Industrial Revolution, and we're all thinking about machines and how we're all cogs in a machine. The problem with this period of time is that it uses copious amounts of resources, human resources, as well as the world's physical resources. And so hopefully you can see where this is starting to tie in with our concerns around what we buy and what, how far we travel, how much of the world's resources we're using. Because essentially we're coming out of the achievist stage. This is the boom and bust kind of mentality. There's a lot of growth goes into those financial bubbles, but when they pop, lots of waste, lots of resources are really depleted very quickly. And it's very unsustainable. Obviously, sustainability is a big buzzword in conscious and ethical consumerism. So this is the following culture, which I believe in this point in time, much of our society in the West is kind of fighting between achievist and pluralist. Pluralist sees the growth and the boom of the achievist stage and says, wow, that really creates a lot of disparity, creates a lot of disconnect, it creates a lot of wealth inequality. So let's put some regulations on this. Let's stop being maybe so driven by growth and be driven more by values. And out of this period of time, we get labor unions, labor rights, consumer rights, minimum wage, a weekend, those sorts of things. It's very egalitarian. It's consensus seeking. It's empowering. It removes the idea of the machine and it puts in place the idea of the family. However, there are some deep contradictions in this culture. There's an unspoken hierarchy that comes from quite a deep contradiction. And that contradiction is that we're tolerant of everybody except for people who can't be tolerant, which causes a problem because it means that there becomes an unspoken hierarchy of the people who know what the values are we should be being driven by and have control over those values. So if you were on the right, you'd call this the PC brigade, or you'd have some problems with cancel culture or PC culture and things like that you'd associate with this group. And so that's kind of an overview, I've got the back here again, of this theory, or called integral theory, which says that these are all cultural developments throughout human history, but they all exist within society today. So you have, as I said, the impulsive culture is there within the criminal world, within the things like gangs and the mafia. You have the traditional culture existing in your state-based organizations. You have the achievist culture in your business culture, your business districts, your business organizations, and you have your pluralist culture within your civic, NGO, not-for-profit organizations, all kind of vying for space, vying for the ear of the government in many ways, vying for the ear of the public, and vying for funding and all these sorts of things. Essentially, in that vying, the achievist, business-minded people are probably the most dominant and will use the most resources and that sort of thing. Anyway, but what integral theory says is this is one of these systems that we need to say, it's not this mountain or that mountain. We need to step out of this system and see actually the pros and cons of each part of this human culture, because typically each culture rejects the previous one. So if we're thinking about this in terms of, say, the impulsive stage is pagan religion, Christian Western religion comes along and looks back at that as infantile and says that all these pagan rituals and all these pagan things needs to be done away with. Then we get science comes along and says, you know what, this Christian culture, that's infantile. This God stuff, we need to get rid of all of that. That's a load of rubbish, get rid of that. Because science and data, that has all the answers. And then you get the postmodernists come along as a pluralist kind of group and say, well, what is truth anyway? Who are the experts? And they react against the science group and say that there's multiple truths, there's multiple facts. And integral theory essentially says we need to step out of this system, stop reacting to the cultures that we've kind of been pushing out and integrate them, hence integral theory. And as I say, I didn't want to give a talk about all the list of things we could do, but to give a kind of more of an overview of how culture has ended up in such a challenging place and with so much inequality, because the pluralist society doesn't quite manage to fix the problem of using growth and GDP as our benchmark in the West, essentially because it's stakeholder driven. So within the pluralist society, you do get people interested in fighting for nature, but it's all disparate. It's all disconnected. You get the World Wildlife Fund fighting for the whales. You get Greta Thunberg fighting for the climate strikes. You get Black Lives Matter fighting for racial justice. You get all these disparate groups that aren't necessarily connected, all with their own special interests, all with their own stakeholders, trying to regulate and lobby for their particular cause, which would be better integrated in a collaborative sense. Because currently we are measuring success by GDP, which is gross domestic product, the monetary value of all finished goods and services made within a country during a specific period. And this is our GDP at the moment, which shows one of those disconnects. The red in the middle was 2008 financial crash. We had a 2% recession there, but in April this year, we had a 10.4% shrinkage on the UK economy. Hence the fact that Rishi Sunak went hell for leather and started trying to give out as much in concessions as possible just to keep things afloat. But some countries are deciding to ditch GDP altogether and think more about using different ways of scaling how we are successful as a culture and how we are successful in incorporating things like well-being and happiness. So I think this is what I'm trying to promote here is a raising of consciousness of the system that we're in. So rather than just tackling individual things like plastic or fuel consumption, we're getting an idea of the whole system and how the whole system maybe is leaning towards something that is emerging and evolving into the future that can be better for all of those things. And I think transcending culture is classic of Christ and what he does. When he says, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, you could take that at face value as some good advice, but culturally, that was a massive step away from the honor-shame system that was prevalent at the time of if you let somebody know that you've done good to them, then they are indebted to you through, bowing to you in the marketplace or honoring your name in the public domain. And so to do good for somebody and not even let your left hand know that your right hand has done it would have been completely countercultural because it meant that you didn't get anything back at all. And it very much Jesus promoting a gift economy, which is a key word in kind of things like Kate Raworth's donut economics, which is I'm going to give you a brief overview of this. This is the idea that rather than using just GDP as a measurement for success, we should be aiming to function within this donut, which is the safe and just space for humanity. It takes into account the environmental ceiling as the outer ring of the donut, and the inner ring of the donut sets out the minimum we need to lead a good life. And that's derived from the UN Sustainable Development Goals and agreed by world leaders of every political stripe. It ranges from food and clean water to a certain level of housing, sanitation, energy, education, healthcare, gender equality, income, and political voice. Anyone not attaining to such minimum standards is living in the donut's hole. So there's a social foundation that we should be aiming to lift everybody into, and also an economic ceiling which we don't want to cross in terms of biodiversity loss, pollution, ocean acidification, etc. This is what we're looking. This is Kate Raworth's model for what we kind of look like at the moment. We've got overshoots and we've got shortfalls on both sides of this model. However, the city of Amsterdam during lockdown have taken on the donut economics model for the city of Amsterdam, which is now trying to use this as a benchmark for how successful they are as a city, meaning that they're going to have pedestrianized zones, ensuring social housing, and those sorts of things. So it's a great aim to try and attain. It's just one part of a very good system that is emerging that could very much change the way that we do things commercially. I'm going to go back to our model here. So we can see that I've got Society 1, Society 2, Society 3, and Society 4 on the bottom row there. And as we've seen that, I think it's suggesting that the impulsive tribal stage was pre-society. People were very much just in their own little factions and groups. And society really kicks in around the traditional period. And the core characteristic of this stage of societal development is a strong central actor that holds the decision-making power of the whole. This could be an emperor, dictator, or a party. It reduced the level of random violence from the previous culture and allowed the community to get access to vital social services. The downsides are its lack of dynamism and in most cases, its lack of nurturing individual innovative freedom. And Society 2 organizes around competition. Historically, the more successfully a society meets the stability challenge of the previous culture, the more likely it is that this stage will be followed by a shift of focus from stability to growth and greater individual initiative and freedom. This shift gives rise to markets and dynamic entrepreneurial sector that fuels economic growth. At this juncture, we see a whole set of innovations, including the introduction of markets, property rights, and a banking system that provides access to capital. These changes facilitated the unprecedented explosion of economic growth and mass industrialization that we saw in Europe in the 19th century, and we are seeing in China and India and emerging economies today. And this is really interesting. This is from Thomas Friedman. He links the rise of emerging economies with the rise of a global virtual middle class. That includes not only today's actual middle class, but also the global community of web and cell phone users who physically still live in poverty, but who mentally already share the aspirational space with the current global middle class. It says that this is a tectonic shift. The Industrial Revolution was 10 million person story. This is a couple of billion story. I think that's really, and is telling of our times, that because of our smartphones and our technology, the more impoverished of the world have an aspiration and can have an aspiration to live like the global middle class, which is probably a small fraction of the world's population, but everyone is fed that big me is the global middle class, and people are fed that, and it means that people are wanting to buy, those trainers, that top that makes them fit into society, and all of this fast fashion. The bright side of this stage is a burst in entrepreneurial initiative. The dark side of this stage includes negative externalities such as unbound commodification and its unintended side effects, including child labor, human trafficking, environmental destruction, and increased socio-economic inequality. And then the pluralist society is really, as I said before, to put the reins on the achievist society and put regulation into place and empower those who are left behind, those who can't achieve quite as much, to a more values-driven culture. And so here's a interesting analogy to kind of bring our thoughts to some sort of a conclusion, perhaps. A nodal system is possibly what society 4.0 looks like, what this evolutionary purpose looks like, which has been referred to as biomimicry in some circles. But it takes the example of what happens in Yellowstone Park in America with the depletion of the population of wolves. When the wolves were depleted in Yellowstone Park, it led to flooding in some of the valleys. And it's a really interesting result. Is like, how does the wolf population lowering mean that there's more flooding in Yellowstone Park? And the people who researched it found out that because there weren't any wolves, there were more deer and more elk who ventured and roamed more into the valleys and the lowlands, and ate a lot of the vegetation, eroded a lot of the banks of the rivers. Because the vegetation wasn't there anymore, the pollinators that sustained on that wildflower disappeared as well, which meant some of the other bigger plants declined as well, that were holding much of the soil's stability together. And so when the rains came, some years after the floods, the wolves had depleted, the eroded banks and all these things, essentially it caused a whole systems shift, because one nodal part of it, of the network, changed the rest of the system. The reintroduction of the wolves meant that the deer and the elk were then kind of brought in under control. The vegetation came back, the pollinators came back, the plants came back, and the flooding stopped in Yellowstone Park. And I think that's interesting in terms of our society. When, for example, retail parks come into society, it pulls people out of areas, villages and things where there were communities and local shops and things. It pulled people out and very much dramatically did something to our systems, our balance, our social system. The benefits of things like convenience stores meant that there's obviously increased leisure time. You can buy a bigger fridge to put all your food in. And so all these these changes, like having more leisure time, means more maybe ability to think about what you want is, and what don't I have now that I can go and buy, and all these sorts of things. So these very interesting changes have ripple effects through systems. And so no matter how much, I guess, we stop buying plastic, or we go into a vegetarian diet and things, there's these systems that really need to be addressed and developed. These are the current system disconnections that a guy called Otto Scharmer puts forward in his book. We've thought about the disconnect between infinite growth and imperative and the finite resources of Earth. We've thought about the disconnect. Well, there is a disconnect between gross domestic product and well-being. We're very much thinking about how we can grow and produce in that regard, but suicide rates and suicide attempts are rocketing. And so there's an element of well-being which is going unchecked. And obviously that should be a part of how successful a society is, but it's not being measured as an output. One of the really interesting ones is the disconnect between the financial and the real economy. There was something like $12 trillion of exchange going on in like global markets, but there's only, for example, 75, so that's trillion, there's only $75 billion being used in the actual sale of resources in the world. So there's this disconnect between like what you can buy and how much money is being spent. There's so much money being spent on things that are not actual real world economic things. There's no, like, in terms of a transaction for a good or things like that. So there's this massive disconnect, and that's how these bubbles grow. These financial bubbles grow and pop. One of the key terms in Otto Scharmer's book is to move from egocentric to ecocentric. If you think about the American dream, it's very egocentric. It's about what I can achieve, and that's kind of one of the real examples of the achievist mindset in growth and in sustaining for yourself. But there's a really interesting story of a woman in Brazil who owns a cafe, who would supply her cafe with locally sourced meat from a farmer, who would be butcher and bring 2 pigs every 2 weeks or something to her little cafe shop, and she'd make her sandwiches and things. And she asked the farmer, what is it that I can do for you that means that all the other cafes in my area can be supplied with your high quality meat. And he said, well, I'd need a refrigerated van to enable that. And so she says, okay, from my profits from my cafe, because I'm doing well, I'm going to loan you the $30,000 to buy the refrigerated van, so you can supply all my competition with the same quality meat that I have, which is, to an achievist, the most backwards thing you could possibly do. Like to remove your unique selling point and make it available to your competition is kind of ridiculous. But she has the mindset of an egocentric economy, where actually if she can bring up the whole, then everybody benefits, and it means that her needs are met and everyone else's needs are met, and they can all kind of lift each other up in a more ecocentric way. Now, these are some books that I recommend reading on, and I can't speak too much to the 4.0 society and the evolutionary kind of model that is emerging, because it's emerging. I've read these books and I'm still kind of coming to terms with it. I feel like I'm digesting a lot of it, but I'm not sure particularly how eloquent I am at going to be able to explain it to you. Also, on top of what I've already just told you, it's kind of a whole other maybe couple of hours to kind of think through all of those things, because it really looks at the whole system. However, my advice to you, or my plea to you, to be more socially conscious, to be more consumer conscious, is to be more conscious of the system, to read maybe some of these books, to understand what the emerging culture is, and become aware of it. I think as somebody who is kind of starting up a new business myself, I'm very aware of not slipping into the achievist model. And I think when I'm aware of that, I'm aware of investors that might want to see growth for growth's sake, rather than for what I really want my enterprise to be, I can be more aware of that and steer away from it, and move into a more emerging culture that is going to be healthier and more ecocentric than egocentric. So yeah, I'd really recommend these 3 books as a starting point, to understand that it's not this mountain or that mountain. There's something else that can be done, and that is being explored by many people, many great thinkers, and it needs to be explored collectively. And also not just me to broadcast to you what Society 4.0 looks like, and because that's kind of what we're already doing. It's very much a collaborative, conscious effort. I'd recommend that if you're going to buy these books, you buy them from abebooks.co.uk. They are second-hand books rather than Amazon or nasty monsters like that. If you would like one piece of actual ethical consumerist advice from me that I think is possibly one of the most impactful things that you can do and take away from this session, that would be to change your bank. Banks are very powerful in lobbying governments, in supplying arms to countries, in investing in oil and fossil fuels. If you want to think about banks that don't do that, then you can easily change to, in the UK at least, Nationwide, which is a building society. By definition, as a building society, they can't invest in anything other than buildings. So the worst they can do is maybe invest in a building for the army, but they don't actually invest in weapons or fossil fuels and things like that. And also it's normally social buildings with Nationwide. I think also in the UK, but also in the US, is Troidos Bank, who are a charity bank. They only invest in social and charitable investment. And although you often, with them, you maybe need more money to start that account. Whereas with Nationwide, you can start with £1. I think Troidos means you have to at least put £1,000 in or something to start with. But it's certainly a more socially conscious way of banking. And then also you could check your investment, your pensions, and where else your money is, because that's really what moves things. So there is a app called Pension Bee, which you can tap in all of your pension details for previous pensions, not generally the pension that you're on at the moment, but for previous pensions, and you can move it out of those pensions and into ones that are investing in sustainable energy and things. They will be at a cost. The interest rate won't be as good, but you'll be you certainly won't be investing in arms or fossil fuels or things like that.